Space between worlds. Zahra grew up in a quiet neighborhood in northern England, where the call to prayer from the local mosque mixed with the chime of church bells down the street. Her parents had moved from Pakistan when they were young, and they raised her and her brothers to honor their faith with a gentle steadiness: daily prayers, Friday sermons, and the warm, crowded iftars during Ramadan that filled their home with laughter and the smell of biryani and samosas. Zahra loved this life, the comfort of knowing who she was, the bond of her community, the way her mother would press a small Quran into her hands each morning before she left for work as a primary school teacher. She'd always been curious about Jesus. In her faith, he was Isa al-Masih, a prophet, a messenger of God, born of the Virgin Mary, who performed miracles and taught kindness. She'd read about him in the Quran, and sometimes she'd watch the children in her class perform nativity plays at Christmas, her heart softening at the story of a baby born in a stable to bring hope. But she'd never thought to look beyond what she'd been taught, until the day Sarah moved into the house next door. Sarah was a nurse, quiet and kind, with grey streaks in her dark hair and a habit of leaving jars of homemade jam on Zahra's doorstep. They struck up a friendship over garden fences and shared cups of tea, talking about everything from teaching to weather to the challenges of raising teenagers. One afternoon, as they sat on Zahra's patio watching their kids chase fireflies, Sarah mentioned she was part of a small Bible study group. "We talk about what it means to follow Jesus," she said gently, "not to argue or change anyone, just to support each other and try to live like he did." Something in Zahra's chest stirred. What if there was more to him? She wondered that night, as she knelt for her evening prayers. She started borrowing books from the library, books that explained the Christian faith from a respectful academic perspective, and she began to read the New Testament, comparing its stories to what she knew from the Quran. The more she read, the more she was drawn to Jesus' words: "Love your neighbor as yourself. Blessed are the merciful. I am the way, the truth, and the life." She was struck by how he didn't just teach about love, he lived it, even when it cost him everything. The questions kept coming, and Zahra found herself torn. She loved her family and her community. The thought of hurting them filled her with dread. She'd seen how some people in her mosque spoke about Christians, and she knew that converting could mean losing the connections that had shaped her whole life. One night, after a particularly hard conversation with her father, who'd noticed she was pulling away from some of their traditions, she broke down in tears on Sarah's doorstep. "I feel like I'm caught between two worlds," she whispered. "I don't want to leave who I am, but I can't ignore what I'm feeling." Sarah held her without saying a word, then handed her a small wooden cross. "Jesus didn't come to take away your culture or your love for your family," she said. "He came to bring you home, to show you how much you're loved." Over the next few months, Zahra's journey deepened. She started meeting with Sarah's Bible study group, where people listened to her questions without judgment and shared their own stories of doubt and discovery. She learned that her love for her faith's traditions, for the value of community, for kindness, for the pursuit of peace, wasn't something she had to leave behind. Slowly, she began to understand that Jesus was the peace she'd been searching for all along, the one who could make sense of both her pain and her joy. The day she decided to be baptized, in a small lake on the edge of town, was cold and bright. Only Sarah and a few close friends were there, but Zahra felt like the whole world was holding its breath. As she emerged from the water, shivering but smiling, she knew she was still Zahra, the daughter of her parents, the sister of her brothers, the teacher who loved her students. But she was also something new, a woman who had found in Jesus a love that didn't ask her to choose between her past and her future. Telling her family was harder than she'd imagined. Her father was quiet for weeks, her mother wept, and her brothers didn't know what to say. But slowly, bit by bit, they began to find their way back to each other. Her mother still brought her samosas on Fridays. Her father still asked about her work. They didn't always understand her faith, but they loved her, and over time, they started to see that the kindness and warmth they'd always cherished in her had only grown stronger. Now, years later, Zahra still starts her days with a cup of tea and a moment of quiet prayer. She teaches her students about different faiths, helping them see the things that connect us all. And on warm evenings, she and Sarah still sit on their patio, watching their kids play. Two women from different worlds, bound by a love that started with a jar of jam and led to something neither of them could have imagined. The first steps home. In the months after her baptism, Zahra walked carefully between two worlds. She still woke before dawn some mornings, the old habit of preparing for fire prayer settling in her bones, even as she now spent those quiet hours reading the Bible and talking to God in her own way. She'd keep the small Quran her mother had given her on her bedside table, next to her worn copy of the Gospels, and sometimes she'd trace her fingers over both covers, feeling the weight of all she carried. Her father, Karim Sr., was the hardest to reach. For weeks he'd barely look at her when she came to visit, his shoulders tight with a grief she knew wasn't about anger, it was about loss. He thinks he's lost his daughter, Zahra realized one afternoon as she watched him polish the wooden prayer beads he'd worn for 40 years. So she started bringing him things that mattered to both of them. The chapati flour his mother used to send from Pakistan, a book about the history of Islamic art she'd spotted at a market, stories about her students, including the little boy from a Muslim family who'd just learned to write his name. One Friday, as Zahra was leaving, her father called her back. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the cushion he usually reserved for prayer. He didn't talk about Jesus or her baptism. Instead, he told her about his own father, how he'd fled violence in their homeland, how he'd carried his faith like a shield to protect his family. "I taught you to hold on to what makes us us," he said, his voice rough. "I was afraid you were letting go of everything." Zahra reached for his hand. "I'm not letting go, Baba," she said softly. "I'm just learning that love is bigger than I thought it could be. The things you taught me, about kindness, about taking care of people, about how faith should make you better, not harder, that's all still there. Jesus just showed me how to live it more fully." He didn't respond, but he squeezed her hand, and that night, he left a pot of his famous lentil curry on her doorstep. Honoring all that she is. Zahra made small choices to weave her two worlds together. During Ramadan, she still joined her family for iftar, helping her mother lay out plates of samosas, pakoras, and sweet jalebi. She'd fast some days, not out of obligation, but as a way to connect with the spiritual discipline she'd grown up with, and to share in the sacrifice her family was making. When her niece was born, she helped organize the akika ceremony, bringing a cross she'd made from olive wood to tuck into the baby's blanket. "It's for protection," she told her sister-in-law, who held it carefully and nodded. At school, Zahra became a quiet bridge between faiths. When her class was learning about festivals, she'd talk about both Eid and Christmas, how both were about light, family, and hope. She'd bring in sheer kurma she'd made with her mother to share during their Eid lesson, and let the kids help her decorate a small Christmas tree with paper stars she'd cut to look like the ones used in Islamic art. Once, a parent from the mosque came to talk to her, worried that her child was being led astray. Zahra invited her to sit for tea and showed her the students' artwork, drawings of angels, prophets, and teachers, all with the same gentle smiles. "We're teaching them to see what connects us," Zahra said. "That's what faith is supposed to do, isn't it?" The day everything changed. 3 years after her baptism, Zahra's mother fell ill with a serious heart condition. For weeks, Zahra spent every evening at the hospital, holding her mother's hand and reading to her, sometimes from the Quran, sometimes from the Bible. One night, as her mother lay sleeping, Zahra whispered a prayer for healing, mixing the words she'd learned as a child with the ones she now knew by heart. When her mother woke up the next morning, she reached for Zahra's hand. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice thin but clear. When I was young, my grandmother used to tell me that God speaks to us in many ways. She said sometimes he sends prophets, sometimes he sends signs, sometimes he sends people who love us enough to show us the way. She touched the small cross Zahra wore around her neck, one she'd always been too nervous to mention before. I was afraid of what this meant, but I see how you love us. I see how you love everyone. That's not something that takes you away from us. It brings you closer. That afternoon, Zahra's father came to the hospital. He brought his prayer beads and sat beside his wife's bed, then looked at Zahra. "Will you read to us?" he asked. She opened her Bible to the Gospel of John and read, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." As she spoke, her father closed his eyes and ran his fingers over his beads, and her mother squeezed her hand. In that quiet room, with the smell of antiseptic and the soft beep of machines, Zahra felt like she was finally home. Not in one place or another, but in the love that held them all together. Now, today Zahra's home is filled with things that tell her story. A tapestry her aunt wove with verses from the Quran, hanging next to a painting of the Nativity. A shelf of books in both Urdu and English. A photo of her family at Eid, with her holding her niece next to the Christmas tree they'd decorated together. She still meets with her Bible study group, and she still goes to the mosque for special occasions. Her family saves her a spot next to them every time. Last month, her father asked her to help him write a letter to his cousin in Pakistan, who'd heard about Zahra's faith and was worried. "Tell him we're still family," he said. "Tell him love doesn't end where differences begin." Zahra smiled as she typed the words, thinking of all the bridges she'd built, between faiths, between generations, between what was and what could be. This is what Jesus taught me, she thought, to love enough to build a way home for everyone.